as I said before, the game consists of 9 turns. There's 5 regular turns, then the debates, then 2 more regular turns, and then election day. In each of the normal turns, 1 through 5, 7, and 8, you're going to go through the 5 phases, a momentum phase, and a campaign strategy and rest phase. I'm first going to take you through a normal turn, going through the phases, and then we'll look at the debates and election day. So on one of your normal turns, before we get to the phase track, there's actually one preliminary phase that you have to go through, and that's called the initiative phase. The first thing that happens in the initiative phase is that each player is going to be drawing new cards from the campaign deck. On turns 1 through 5, they're going to draw 6 cards each, and then on turns 7 and 8, you're going to draw 7 cards each. So the very first thing you do on a turn is draw your new cards. So each player draws 6 cards for turn 1. The second preliminary thing you do on a turn in the initiative phase is the initiative check to see who's going to go first in this turn. You remember at game setup, the political capital bag was seated with 10 cubes from each player. On the initiative check part of the initiative phase, you're going to randomly draw 1 cube and then a second cube, and you keep drawing until you get 2 cubes of the same color. So in this case we got 2 red cubes, so the Nixon player is going to have the initiative and go first on each phase of turn 1. All of the drawn cubes will go back to the player's supply. Now you can begin with the first phase of the first turn. In each of the phases 1 through 5 of this turn, each player is going to play 1 card from their hand. So on phase 1, the Nixon player goes first and plays a card, then the Kennedy player plays a card. And then you advance to phase 2, where the Nixon player plays a card, then the Kennedy player plays a card, and so on up through to phase 5. Then after the Kennedy player plays a card on phase 5, you go into momentum phase, and then the campaign strategy and rest phase. So in each phase you have the opportunity to play a card. You can play a card in one of 2 ways. You can play it either for the campaign points or for the event. Whether I play a card for the event or the campaign points, I always gain the number of rest cubes that are on the card. So this card says gain 1 rest cube, so I'll take one of my cubes and put it into my rest area, which is the coffee mug. Let's first look at playing a card for the event. To play a card for the event, you read the event that's on the card and do whatever it says to do on the board. When you play a card as an event, you remove the card from the game. So once an event happens, it can never happen again. When you play a card for the event, it may be one of the special events, in which case you play it up here at the top of the board. To remind you, a preventative event is going to give you some benefits immediately, but also prevent some other events from being played in the game. You'll play it up here at the top to remind you of that prevention. If you play a debate event, you'll play it to the top of the board up here in the debate events. You won't get any benefit from it immediately, but you will get to play the event during the debate. Or you may play an election day event, in which case you won't get the benefits of it until election day. So when you play a card as an event, it's either going to happen now and go out of the game, or it's going to go up here in one of these persistent events. If I don't want to play a card for the event, I can play it to use the campaign points. I can play these campaign points in one of 3 ways. The first way is by campaigning in states. The second is to advertise in a certain region. And the third way is by using them to work on the issues track to gain support in a certain issue. However I decide to spend my campaign points, the event is still open for play by the other player. So if I'm the Nixon player and I'm playing my campaign points, I do one of the 3 things with my campaign points, and then the Kennedy player could come in here and say I want to activate that event. He does so by using one of his momentum markers, pays that, and can activate the event and do whatever it says. As the Nixon player, however, if I want to make sure that the Kennedy player can't activate that event, before I start doing my campaigning points, I can spend 2 of my momentum markers to preempt the event, and then if I do that, then the Kennedy player couldn't come in here and activate this event. But if I don't pay the 2 momentum markers to preempt the event, the Kennedy player could pay 1 momentum marker to activate the event, do whatever it says to do, and then because the event happened, this card is removed from the game. Otherwise, the card is put in a discard pile. So you can spend the campaign points either by campaigning in states, advertising in a region, or working on the issues. Let's take a look at each of these in a little more detail. First, campaigning in states. So to start the game, in some of these states, Nixon has some red cubes showing that he has some support in these states. In other states, there are blue cubes showing that Kennedy has support in those states. If you have any cubes in a given state, you're said to be leading that state. If you have 4 cubes in a state, you're said to be carrying that state. What are the benefits of each of these? Well, at the end of the game, for any state that you lead, that is, that you have at least 1 support cube in, you're going to get the electoral votes for that state. When you have 4 cubes in a state, what that means is when your opponent comes in and campaigns in that state, it's going to be harder for him to do that because he's going to have to make what's known as support checks in a state that you are carrying. Now, when you're campaigning in states, you can only add support to states in the region that your candidate token is currently in. But you can add support in any states in that region. So right now, Nixon can add state support in any state in the West. So as a simple example, let's say I played this card for the campaign points, for 4 campaign points. As an example of what I could do is I could add 4 cubes in the West. So maybe 1 in New Mexico, 1 in Idaho, 1 in Utah, and 1 in Nevada. But what if I didn't want to campaign in the West? What if I wanted to go and campaign in the South? Well, it takes 1 campaign point to move from one region to another. So as a Nixon player, if I played the 4 campaign points, I could use 1 of those campaign points to move from the West region to the South region. And then I would have 3 campaign points left to campaign in the South. Another important thing to understand is that at any given time in a state, you can only have support cubes of 1 color. So if I'm in the South and I wanted to campaign in Louisiana, let's say, I couldn't just immediately start adding red cubes to Louisiana. You first have to remove the blue cubes that are there. So I have 3 campaign points remaining because I used 1 to get from the West to the South. So I could use 2 of them to remove the 2 blue support cubes there in Louisiana. Then I have 1 more campaign point left, so I could add 1 support cube in Louisiana. The 2 blue cubes will go back to the Kennedy player's supply. Now, because I've used the full 4 campaign points by moving and then campaigning in Louisiana only, my candidate token would remain there. That's where I end up. However, for my last campaign point here, if I didn't add my support cube in Louisiana, I could use my last campaign point to maybe remove one of these blue cubes in Mississippi. So in summary, I've used 1 campaign point to get from the West to the South, 2 of them to remove the 2 blue support cubes in Louisiana, and the last one to remove 1 blue support cube in Mississippi. So where do I end up, in Louisiana or Mississippi? It really doesn't matter, you can choose one or the other. So I might choose Louisiana. Let's reset this and talk about the case if Kennedy were carrying the state of Louisiana. So let's assume that Kennedy had 4 support cubes in Louisiana, and I'm starting my turn. I'm playing this card for 4 campaign points, and I'm in California. I spend 1 of them to move to the South, and then I want to campaign in Louisiana. But Kennedy is carrying the state of Louisiana right now because he has at least 4 cubes there. To campaign in Louisiana, I have to do what's known as support checks. I first say how many campaigning points I'm going to commit to campaigning in Louisiana. Let's say I want to commit the rest of what I have, which is 3. So I have to do 3 support checks in Louisiana. A support check is really just drawing a cube from the political capital bag. So I draw 3 cubes from here at random. I drew 2 blue and 1 red. So only 1 was a success, so I can only remove 1 blue cube of support from Louisiana. The cubes drawn from the political capital bag go back into the supply of the players. Now I spent 3 campaign points campaigning in Louisiana and only got rid of 1 blue support cube. But the Kennedy player no longer carries the state of Louisiana, so on a future turn I don't have to do the support checks to campaign in Louisiana and remove some of those blue cubes. Another way that I would have to draw support cubes if I were campaigning in Louisiana is if the Kennedy player token was currently in Louisiana when I campaign in Louisiana. So even though Kennedy only has 2 support cubes there, because his candidate token is there, if the Nixon player comes in and wants to campaign in Louisiana, he still has to do support checks because the Kennedy player token is there. So to summarize what we just talked about, the first way that you could spend these campaign points instead of playing the event is by campaigning in the states. You take the number of campaign points on the card and you can use them to campaign in states across the board. You can add support to any state within the region that your candidate token is currently in. You can use some of your campaign points to move your candidate token to other regions. It costs 1 to move to an adjacent region. And then if your opponent is carrying a state, meaning he has at least 4 support cubes in that state that you want to campaign in, you have to do support checks to campaign in that state. And again, you can use these points and campaigning in states and moving your candidate token interchangeably. So I could use 4, I could use 1 to move, 1 to campaign, another one to move, and another one to campaign. If you don't want to spend these campaign points on campaigning in states, a second alternative you have is to advertise in any one of the regions on the board. It doesn't have to be the region your candidate token is currently in. So I could be in the West and spend these campaign points on advertising in the East. So let's say I wanted to spend these 4 campaign points to advertise in the East as Nixon. To advertise in a region, you simply draw the number of cubes from the political capital bag equal to the number of campaign points on the card. So I'm going to draw 4 cubes to advertise in the East. So in this case I drew 3 red cubes, which are mine, and 1 blue cube, which is the Kennedy player's. So I get 3 advertising cubes in the East. So I just put them in the advertising box. Again, it doesn't have to be in the region that your candidate token is currently in. It can be in any region on the board. But just like the support cubes in states, there can only be 1 color cube in the advertising box in any region. So if there were 2 Kennedy support cubes of advertising in the East when I did this, and I drew the 3 red cubes, I would have to use 2 of them to remove the 2 Kennedy cubes there first, and then I would have 1 left to put in the advertising box. So what benefit do I get from having support cubes in an advertising box in a region? Well, if I have support cubes in advertising in a region, I'm exempt for doing support checks in that region. So let's assume that Kennedy had 4 support cubes in Rhode Island, and I had a cube of advertising in the East as Nixon. If I played a 4 campaign point card and used 1 campaign point to move to the South and 1 to move to the East, I have 2 left, and if I campaign in Rhode Island, normally I would have to do support checks. But because I have a cube of support in advertising in the East, I'm exempt from support checks, so I can simply just remove 2 blue cubes from Rhode Island without having to do support checks. You're exempt from having to do support checks both in the case where your opponent has at least 4 as well as the candidate token.